We've already previously seen how we can create a pivot table very quickly using the recommended pivot tables. But what we're now going to have a look at is the ability to reference values that are displayed in a pivot table and use them outside of that pivot table. Something that might seem straightforward, but actually isn't. In order to do that, let's take our Sales Inc. 2013 and quickly create one of our recommended pivot tables. Insert, recommended pivot tables, and we'll take this one here, the first one, sum of the total price by month. Okay, thank you very much. Now that gives us the total price that has been spent. But what we also want is the current quantity. So I'll bring that down to here. And that gives us the total number of items that have been spent. Now, if we wanted to add another column here that worked out the average by effectively dividing the total price by the quantity, then we can do that. Let's add ourselves a heading. And we can use our normal logic, which is to say equals that cell there. Now notice how the formula just doesn't say B4. It says get pivot data, sum of total price, because that's the column, A3, that's where the table starts, month name, that's these, January. So it's going to get the value for the sum of the total price for the month name January. And we're going to divide that by that cell there. And again, I'm given another get pivot data formula, which says sum of cur QTY, which is the column heading. A3 is the start of the table, and then again month name January. And when I press return, we get 8.1565 as our average. Let's change that into money, $8.16. Now ordinarily you would think, let's take this formula and replicate it down to the bottom, and it will give us the average for each of the other months. Unfortunately, as you can see, it doesn't. It just repeats the same formula, 816, 816, 816. The reason for that, if I check this one here, is it's still looking at January, and it's still looking at January in the second. So the get pivot data function is not a relative function. As soon as you copy it, it just copies the internal values. However, we could make it a relative function. And in order to make it a relative function, what we do is we'll go back to the first function. We always start with the first one and then replicate. And where it's telling it to get January, why don't we tell it to actually get the January title from a cell that contains January? And then when we replicate, it will look at a cell that contains February and then March. How logical is that? Well, let's delete January, including the speech marks, and tell it to go get the value that is in A4. We need to do the same with the second function. So the divide by 1, again, let's remove the January, including the speech marks, and tell that to look at January that is in A4. When we press return, we get the same value, $8.16, but we can now replicate this function, and we see that it then works out the value for us. Let's just check on May, because it's now using the same get pivot data function, same column, same start place for your table, the same month name column, but the value is now A8, which happens to be May, which is the row that we're in. And we're dividing by the sum of the quantity, starting in A3, using the month name as the lookup, using A8. That's how we can effectively trick the get pivot data function to go and get the correct row of information that we're after. So we can use a simple link equals a cell within a pivot table that will then produce the get pivot data function for us. So we don't have to get the mechanics right for that, because you would have to really name these columns and lookups the correct name that the pivot table is using. So that's the column heading and then the column name here. We just change the reference so that it being a static fixed value to a cell, so that when we replicate, it then changes what it's looking at. So that gives you the ability to then use functions based on values that are sat inside a pivot table. If the pivot table updates itself and these values change, your functions will change. There is one little caveat to be wary of. Because the pivot table rewrites itself, if refreshing the pivot table causes it to effectively create more columns, it will overwrite your functions here. So you just have to be sure where you're adding these, that any refresh of the data really is only going to change those numbers. And in our case, it will. There are only 12 months of the year. There's not suddenly going to be a 13th month selected, and we're only going to sum the price and the quantity. So these columns will stay in place. The numbers will likely change on a refresh, in which case our averages will change on a refresh.